Dr. Carol, you're a fan favorite. Welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, it is so awesome to be back with you guys. Again, I feel like we're sisters, and,
Yeah.
and this is just an awesome conversation. I'm excited and grateful.
Well, your last episode was so good on what's happening in menopause. And it's been a favorite episode for our listeners because we're all a little bit shooting in the dark on this.
Yep.
And you just made it so simple, not simple, but you made it understandable to the layperson what's happening in our bodies. And it was so helpful. So we thought we definitely need to have you back on. And this just feels like a really great space for you to speak into because it does dovetail well with that conversation on menopause. And so, can you tell us as we dive into, you know, what's happening in our bodies in midlife and how is that impacting our sex life? That is a question that many people have, and yet it feels a little uncomfortable to talk about. And especially for some, and maybe we're talking about it with our doctor, but maybe that's really the only place we're talking about it.
Mm,
So, can you just enlighten us on what's going on?
sure. Well, I am excited to talk about this because it affects every single one of those of us with XX chromosomes. Um, Around midlife, starting sometime for most women in their 40s and then up through into their early 50s, the hormones in our body change dramatically. And certainly that impacts our sex life. And it's not only just what the experience is in the moment when you are being sexually connected with your spouse. It affects everything else that goes along with that. It affects what you think about sex. It affects your arousal, how long it takes to get aroused, what the physical sensations are like during the sexual encounter. And there's also a lot of other interplay here around midlife. You know, the kids are often out of the house, so empty nest, you're looking at the rest of your life, God willing, with this person you wake up to next. So relationship issues are harder to ignore when there's not kids at home.
Mhm.
There's also old stuff. I see a lot of women around midlife where old stuff, they can't ignore it any longer.
Mhm.
So the hormone changes that happen around the whole menopause transition, that season, um, make some big differences in our whole mental and physical experience around sexuality, intimacy, and all of that. It happens regardless of your relationship status, also, whether you're married or not married. And I'm one who believes, as I believe you do, that God intended sex to be between a husband and wife within a covenant marriage. But even those of us like myself who are not married, I'm widowed, my husband passed away, but we are still sexual beings and we notice things in our bodies and our thoughts and feelings about all of that. So it kind of impacts everything.
Yeah, that emotional element and that relational element. How are
Yeah.
hormones impacting maybe our emotional responses? I think of the stereotype of the woman in menopause who maybe has anger bursts or
Sure.
short temper. Is that real or is that just a perception that we have?
The emotional things that tend to be more obvious around menopause are real, in part because of the hormone changes and in part because of life stage. Some of the hormonal things, um, when the estrogen level drops at menopause, many women struggle with sleep. So if
Mhm.
you're awakened a lot at night with night sweats or hot flashes, your body doesn't feel the same or as good, well, you're going to be more irritable. Things that might not have bothered you quite the same before may bother you a lot more now. Relationship issues are harder to ignore. And so the things that are underneath tend to more easily boil over. And a woman who doesn't feel good in her body is going to struggle more with the emotional aspects of her life as well. That doesn't mean an excuse. It just means it's a bigger challenge. And a woman going through this transition has to be perhaps more intentional than she had before about caring for herself, starting with physically caring for her body in ways that are necessary so that she can manage the emotional and relational aspects.
Yeah. So what does that look like? I mean, tell us can you define that a little
Sure.
bit? What does it mean to care for your body in this season?
Yeah. The OBGYN part of me, I do want to start mentioning hormones in particular, just briefly. With the drop in estrogen, a woman's vaginal, genital, bladder areas all are more irritable, get infections easier, sex can become painful, and does for most women without treatment. And so that can boil over into, well, my husband wants it and my body doesn't, so push away, and that can rile up into struggles. So one thing I like to suggest, just first of all, is consider talking with your doctor about local cream, tablets, or whatever. It doesn't have to be a pill. It can be applied just vaginally, and that can make a huge difference in just the way your body feels, especially as it comes to relationships and sexuality. Other things that become more important is to pay attention to your sleep and rest. When I was in my 20s and going through medical training, there were times that of necessity, I was on call in the hospital for like 36 hours straight, and I might sleep an hour. And I had to continue to function. I can't do that now. And I think you have to acknowledge that your body isn't 20 years old anymore, and give yourself grace and do what it takes to get the appropriate rest, to get the appropriate nutrients, eating healthy, get exercise. You may have felt like you could ignore some of those basics in the past, and you really can't now in the same way that maybe you could have before.
Yeah, that's really true. And I like what you said about we do start to have more margin in this season of life because people need us less, especially if you're a parent. I mean, in some ways you're needed more with maybe your parents. So,
Yes.
there's that happening too,
Yes.
where maybe you're caregiving more for your parents. So maybe in that way you're needed more. But in general, maybe time opens up a little bit in this season and we're paying attention as there's less activity in the house. And so we are more aware.
Yeah.
And that does make a difference. And how we fill that time matters. And that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes. Yes. And being intentional about what you say yes to. For many women that I talk with who are in their, 40s, 50s, 60, whatever, because they have lived life for a while, they get more outside requests. Okay, maybe their children aren't the primary focus in the way that they were. But there are other opportunities, whether it's career-wise, whether it's at church or volunteering or whatever. And it can be easy just to start saying yes to everything. You mentioned aging parents. Many in this midlife season are in what I sometimes call the sandwich generation. Okay, there's kids, maybe they're now, teens or young adults, but their parents are aging, and it kind of all falls on you. So there are some women that feel like the pressures are even more. And so, yes, what I want to say is be intentional about the things that you say yes to. Be sure that you're saying yes to something because God would invite you to do it, not because you're people pleasing or you feel like you have to. Make sure that it is God who is asking you to do something when you say yes to, whether that's for your family or outside the family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would wonder too, if there are some relationship issues that women may be saying yes to escape. I mean, I hate to put it so bluntly, but if I don't want to deal with something and I'm busy over here, then that helps me avoid some of those negative feelings or even patterns that are becoming more and more obvious at home.
Yes, yes. One thing I hear from lots of women in this season of life is, my husband wants sex and I'm just done with it. I don't anymore. And a woman can feel like I've been saying yes in a pattern for maybe years and it hasn't been good. And I just can't put up with it anymore. And I hear from husbands whose wives have said that with the husbands are feeling deep pain and loneliness and rejection. But the wife has said, I've lived this way for 20 years and I'm not going to do it anymore. So you're exactly right that those patterns of communication, or in some ways not communicating, definitely impact the relationship, the marriage, and sexuality in particular. So yeah, if I'm busy over here, then maybe my husband will, ignore me, or I take a fight because I don't want to deal with the real stuff. So sadly, that's too often the case.
Yeah. And all of that impact. Oh, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Well, it just hurts my heart to hear that and to hear you say that it's common. So what do you say? What is your response? Let's speak to those women who are listening right now who resonate with what you just said. What is your response and encouragement to them as they look forward in their marriage and their sex life?
That is the perfect question. And I love talking with women about this. First, take care of your body. If your body is not doing well, you are not going to have much internal resilience to deal with your husband, let alone anything else. We talked about that briefly already. Second, deal with your own stuff. I am one who believes that we have all been harmed sexually in some way, some in small amounts, some in large amounts. Just within the last few months, I took a group of women through an online masterclass series, we called it, for several weeks, dealing with past sexual trauma. Sometimes that may be just, being sexualized too young. Sometimes it can be overt abuse and harm or rape or whatever. Sometimes that is trauma in married sex. Sometimes our pornified culture embeds itself even into the marriage relationship. And so deal with your own heart. My new book, Expectations, I talk a lot about that. Love it, hate it, want it, don't want it. Why? Look at the reasons underneath, and address what sexuality, intimacy, what does that mean to you? What comes up in your soul around that? Because if that isn't dealt with, especially around menopause, your body is going to have a harder time responding physically than before, because you don't have the same kind of hormonal push to engage sexually with your husband as you might have before. When reproductive hormones, estrogen and progesterone and so on, when that drops at menopause, those couples who persist can enjoy the best sex of their lives, but there isn't the same kind of hormonal push to do that. So you have to deal with the other barriers. So yes, address that in your own heart. And then third, talk about it. Talking about sex can feel hard. I think many women in our midlife season grew up learning that it's not something you talk about. And then in the church, it's hard to talk about. So it can be an internal leap to try and start talking about sex. But I believe that's really, really important. Talk about it with your sisters. This needs to be an ongoing conversation that we have among ourselves as women, and then talk about it with your husband and talk about it with Jesus.
Okay, there you go. Talk about it with Jesus. How often are we taking issues from our sex life to Jesus? I mean, my guess is not much. I mean, that's I'm thinking about my own life, and that's so interesting. Talk about it, because it's part of how God made us. And so why do we keep that to ourselves. I mean, that's just it's really interesting to think about. And I love what you're saying, like bring it to the light, continually bring it to the light, and continually talk about it, have those conversations. And the more you do, the more comfortable it will become. And so maybe at first it feels a little weird to talk to your spouse about it or your friends, but eventually it won't be weird anymore because now you are talking about it. And it's not a one-time, that's also what I was thinking when you were talking. It's not a one-time conversation where you talked about it 5 years ago, check, we're done. It is, no, we need to talk about it in every season. And as we transition to different seasons, and as our bodies transition or life stage transitions, whatever. And so to continually have those conversations, because it is true. I've talked to several women recently who basically have said, my husband and I, we don't have sex very much. We don't, we've maybe had it twice in a year and that does signal something. That signals a red flag that something is happening in the marital relationship that needs to be addressed. And like you said, that's so much deeper than just sex. And yet sex is, in some ways, it's a diagnostic tool as well. So how do you encourage people who are in that position where their spouse has become a stranger and they don't even know where to start?
Oh, Krista, I love that question. And I talk with a lot of those women, sadly, too often. And you've illustrated a couple things in just the way you set that up. One is it's almost never, I could say never, but I would probably want to say almost never, primarily a sex problem. It's almost always a relationship problem. So look for the underlying relationship issues and address that. It may not be easy, but get one level deeper. Look at the relationship issues. Maybe you haven't been communicating well. Maybe you have developed a pattern in your marriage where you don't talk about hard things. One of you is people pleasing, or one of you is controlling, micromanipulating, demanding, whatever, those power differential issues. Maybe there's things that you get triggered by around sexuality and intimacy with your husband that you've never really talked about. So absolutely address those other relationship issues. And encouragement. There has been research published last year, Shanti Feldheim and Dr. Michael Seitzma, about married sex and couples who struggled there. And one of the big defining factors in the quality of their sex life was, were they talking about sex? We actually have data showing that couples who talk about sex have a better sex life, more frequency, more enjoyment, more satisfaction. So how do you start that if you and your husband haven't been talking about it? I would say something like this: honey, we've been married X years and I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful God brought us together. I also know that the next years of our lives can even be better if we get intentional about it. Can we talk about what we want our relationship to look like in a year, 5 years, 10 years from now, and how we can work together to make that happen? Oh, open the topic that way. You're not saying something that he should do or not do, or what you want or don't want. You're not leading with that. You're opening a conversation about, can we get on the same page in making the relationship stronger, more vital? And for many husbands in midlife, sex is going to be one of the things they want. That can be an open door. If sex isn't happening, the question is not, okay, just go do it. The question is why? Why isn't it happening? Some of the things that can make a big difference, especially for women in midlife, pay more attention to foreplay. Schedule sex so your mind is ready at a given time. That still counts. Scheduled sex still counts. But with the foreplay thing, one of the changes that hormone changes in midlife create is arousal takes longer. That's normal. It's okay. Some women have a higher sex drive around menopause because of some of those hormonal changes. If that's you, you're not weird. It's okay. If it's not, talk with your husband about what might help me want to move closer to you. What makes me feel safe or unsafe? And how could you help me feel safer and more attracted to you? I talked with one woman who was going through menopause, and she said, if he would just sit down to me, hold my hand, and we could watch a movie together, I could get in the mood. Talk about that. Help him know how he can help you. So those are a few things.
My OB just gave me good, clean love. Do you prescribe that to people, or do you give that samples to people? I thought that was great too, because basically it's a lubricant for vaginal dryness, and
Yes.
it helps with sex. So, and it also helps with some of the issues that women are experiencing. So I recommend that product, just throwing
Sure.
that out there.
Yep.
So that's
Yes.
also a good segue, Carol, to what's happening in men's bodies in midlife, and what do we need to know about that?
Yeah. Testosterone levels fall in a man's body, just like estrogen levels fall in a woman's body. The thing about it for men is it's much more gradual. Women, there's like a cliff for many women in the fall of hormones. For men, it happens gradually over time. And there are a lot of other factors that affect a man's performance in the bedroom. And so erectile dysfunction becomes an issue for many men. That can lead to a lot of performance anxiety for some husbands. It can lead to feeling of inadequacy and shame. Some men struggle to talk about it, acknowledge it, get medical help for it. So I just want to say to wives, if that is a factor for your husband, realize how much a man's sexual performance means to him and his sense of his manhood, and give some grace there. Be a safe place to talk about it. Be an invitation where this is where we can address it. Another thing that can happen in midlife for men, again, is the mind, body, purpose, soul, all that integrated part. For them, it can often feel like in midlife, is this as good as it's going to get? I poured all myself into my career, the classic kind of midlife crisis. There can be a lot of dimensions to that, but it impacts a man's interest in sex, ability to perform. For some husbands, if they are still feeling sexually strong and they don't have any ED problems, this can be one of the few areas that they want to nurture their manhood. So I say to wives, realize what this means to your husband, and engage with him, talk about it. One question I get from wives at times about in this season is it ever okay to say no to sex? And here's the way I answer the no question. Sex, God designed to bring husband and wife together. If it is driving you apart, it's actually a gift to say no, or not right now, or not today, or let's deal with this first. There is a difference between duty, obligation sex and the gift of sexual intimacy with your husband. So for wives who struggle here, take a mental step towards your husband. If you are able to give this as a gift, that is a beautiful thing. Even if you might not have wanted it or thought about it today, if it can become a gift, yes. If it becomes something that brings resentment in your heart, deal with that. And you may need to say no, or not today, or let's deal with this first.
Let's deal with this first. And just to reiterate, so our listeners are really clear, that we're talking about a relationship, a marriage relationship that is safe.
Thank you.
And,
yes.
And that there isn't an element of forced anything, that
Yes.
you have agency as a person and as a woman. And we are assuming that you want the best for your husband as well.
Yes.
And that you love and care for him. And so that's the context with which we're talking about this topic.
Thank you, Alex. This is assuming your husband is a person of goodwill. If there is toxicity, trauma, harm, abuse, infidelity, porn use, those are big deals. And that changes the equation. I just want to second what you said. Incredibly important.
Okay. So let's assume that's the case. And let's assume we want things to go well. What are some things, I don't know, approaches, help us spice it up, Dr. Carol. Tell the women in midlife what we can do to strengthen our marriage in this area.
Yeah. Change it up. Sometimes the routine can be satisfying and comforting, but spicing it up can mean simple changes that really add to your experience. If the kids are out of the house, have sex in a different room, in the kitchen, on the back porch, whatever. Have it in a different place. Change up the foreplay. Include other senses. Maybe you have a little more time to plan now. That would be nice. The physical senses that maybe you just ignored for a while, something that feels real comfortable to your skin, that makes you feel sexy. The lights, the flowers, the fragrance or whatever, go ahead and include those things. Read a marriage sex book with your husband and talk about it. Stretch yourself to engage in some sexual activities that might be a little different than you would engage before. Try some different activities or positions. Be playful. I do want to be careful to say, if your husband is asking for something and it feels demeaning or dirty to you, no, I am not encouraging you to pass that barrier in your soul. I'm encouraging you to be playful and have fun. I can mention a friend of mine, Dr. Jennifer Degler, who a lot of what she has done is about this very thing, helping Christian wives find fun and playful ways to engage. You mentioned, Krista, various lubricants. Yeah, some of those have the tinglies and all. Go for it. Enjoy. So the point is to be playful. You and your husband might have teased and flirted when you were younger. Do that again. And then talk about what you like and what you don't like. We've talked about talking about sex. Well, this is one of the things to talk with your husband about with some frequency. I'm going to say at least several times a year, at minimum. Talk about what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy. Dream a little bit yourself and together. What might we like to try and explore? Some of it might work, some of it might not. So, yeah.
Those are great. I mean, are there any specific books? Obviously, your book's Expectations is a great place for people to start. But are there any other resources that you find particularly helpful?
For the medical side, if a woman just wants to find out more or struggling, Genev, GENNEV.com. It's kind of a online menopause everything clinic. It is not specifically Christian related, but the things that we've kind of alluded to, hormones or lubricants, even some nutritional thoughts and whatever, that can be a good source also. I do have a book, Dr. Carol's Guide to Women's Health, that includes a lot of that. So feel free to check that out. What Sexpectations says, this is not specifically a book about a better married sex life. This is a book about dealing with the matters of the heart that for married women will result in more availability for intimacy and connection sexually. And this just gives me an opportunity. I did want to say one thing too about intimacy and sex. They are related, but not the same. You need intimacy. God created all of us, every human being. God created us with the need, desire, and capacity for intimacy, regardless of relationship status or gender or whatever. And that definitely applies if you're married, but it also applies to single women. For sex in marriage, God designed sex and intimacy to be connected as a way to bring husband and wife together. So that is why focusing on not only the physical, you address the physical, but then also the emotional, relational, and spiritual components that has to come together for the kind of intimacy that God designed marriage to be. I also just want to say, if you do have some single listeners that don't have a husband, for your heart to grieve is okay. I know what it's like to have to live single again. In my case, after my husband died. So I just want to pause and acknowledge those aches in your soul and bring that to Jesus too. He understands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an ache and a hard thing. And so, I mean, what do single women do for just dealing with that and trying to figure that out, that this is part of how God made me, but I don't have a way to express that in the same way a married person does. So what do they do?
Yeah. First, remember that God made you a sexual being for a reason. And that is because it is a copy of who he is. God, the Father, God, the Son, God, the Holy Spirit, they experience perfect, infinite intimacy within themselves and created us in his image with that need. He couldn't create us in his image without building in us the need for intimacy that is different from sex. Remember that Jesus experienced humanness when he was here on earth with sex hormones and sexual desires, but he never got married and he never had sex. How did he do that? I believe two things were important for Jesus that perhaps apply especially for unmarried women like me. And one is he sought intimacy with others. No, that doesn't mean physical sex, but it does mean the heart needs. There is a lot of that God intends for us to have met with others in the body of Christ. That's part of what I think sisterhood really should be. Not just superficial stuff, but really addressing those deeper needs to see and be seen, to know and be known. You can pursue that without having sex. And it's really, really important. And then another piece, intimate connection daily with your Heavenly Father, like Jesus did. Bring these desires and needs to him. Submit your sexuality daily to Jesus. That makes a difference because he does understand. I'm not pretending that that's always easy, but some things that I have learned in my own life and I have seen make a difference for others, especially perhaps unmarried women.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you speak from experience, and it's helpful.
Yeah.
So as we close today, Dr. Carol, and this podcast is all about rising to meet life's challenges and opportunities with strength and courage and faith. And how would you encourage women to rise in this area?
Yeah. Two things I would say. Number one, deal with your stuff. Don't pretend that you can keep it hidden and it doesn't impact you and those around you, certainly your marriage, but your relationships with others too. So whatever that stuff is, whether it's old trauma, whether it's resentments between you and your husband or others, whether it's things you don't want to talk about that you really need to, loneliness, fear, anxiety, physical stuff, your body isn't feeling well, deal with the stuff. Be intentional. God hasn't given anybody else the right or responsibility to deal with your stuff except you. Do what it takes. See your doctor, get with girlfriends, have conversations with your husband, get some marital help if you need to. Talk about all this stuff with Jesus. So go there. And then second, pursue intimacy. I said intimacy, not sex. If you're married, that should include sex. And we've talked about some of the sometimes long road to get there, but pursue it. I think every woman, married or not married, needs a few other people in her life that know her, see her, and then you offer the same to them. Most of the time, when I talk to people struggling in these kinds of areas, that's the biggest challenge. Okay, I try harder if I'm struggling with certain behaviors. Okay, maybe hard, but I do that. Okay, I pray, yes. But connecting deeply with 1, 2, 3, a few others takes intention. I don't do that easily. I have to exert energy. Jesus did that. Who is your Peter, James, and John? Every human being needs that. It's messy. It's not easy, but it is worth it. If you are married, I can promise you that pursuing that, finding your Peter, James, and John, or maybe for us women, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, okay, it will also improve your marriage if you are married. So that would be my encouragement about how we can rise, perhaps especially in this midlife season.
Thank you, Carol. This has been really helpful. I appreciate you so much.
Well, I'm honored to be here. And just lastly, Sexpectations, Reframing Your Good and Not So Good Stories About God, Love, and Relationships. yoursexpectations.com. More about this and a lot of our similar resources.
Thank you.